So good morning, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm Paul Geringer. I'm also with the Ag Law Education Initiative. There's our information up there. You can find us on social media as well. I'm going to keep going. None of this is legal advice. University programs are open to all. I'm going to keep going because we have a lot of content to hit. So we're going to talk about some implications, mainly through air quality regulations and a couple of other court decisions that could have impacts moving forward. Keep in mind always, as I point out to people, these are my thoughts on how things would play out. If I was actually right on anything, does anybody know where I would be right now? Not here. I would be more wealthier and on a beach somewhere. So many people know what Prop 12 is. How many people have heard of Prop 12, a California law that went into effect basically last year? This will impact how the majority of eggs and pork coming into the state of California has to be raised in order to be sold. In a lot of this, there were claims that it violated the Dormant Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. How many people knew at 8:13 on a Friday morning you were going to be learning constitutional law? Did anybody want to do this? If anybody's watching this on TV later, I am sorry for you. So the Commerce Clause regulates all the trade between the states, foreign nations, and the several Indian nations within the country. The Dormant Commerce Clause is an idea that the Supreme Court created in the 1800s that typically says states can't set rules that discriminate against other products coming in from other states. Prop 12 was thought to be one of those laws. The idea is that the federal courts have not agreed with the groups bringing claims so far. Supreme Court heard it last year. Justice sided with the ag groups. Anybody want to know why the Justice Department sided with the ag groups? We'll talk about all the horrible things that could potentially happen that Congress and the federal government would like to stop because of this. And they're my favorite kind of opinions. A fractured opinion. We had a 5-4 decision where the majority only got a majority vote in certain sections, so it became harder to figure out what the actual rules are out of that. But within that majority opinion, the basic idea is there was never a substantial burden highlighted on interstate commerce. The ag groups never did a good job of showing what that burden would be. If you had actually been able to show that burden, it would have flipped the court opinion. Everybody keeps pointing out some of the issues with this. They also highlighted a Maryland law that the Supreme Court allowed to stand from, I believe, the 80s, basically based around the idea that gas stations cannot be owned by refiners. They have to be owned by secondary companies in some way. So they viewed this in similar fashion to what Prop 12 is, that they could set these rules. And I need to point out with this too, I always sometimes forget to point this out in a lot of this, is it applies to basically all pork in the state of California, but sausage pork. For some reason, they did not care how sausage was raised. They cared how every other pork product was raised within it, but sausage was exempted for some reason from all of that. The biggest reason we talk about this is we're looking at this from the standpoint of it does potentially open the doors for states to develop more stringent requirements for stuff coming into their states for how it's being produced. So as I use the example, and this was an example used a lot by people looking at this decision early on, is that if we do it, we can have certain labor requirements, certain healthcare requirements, certain other standards setting in for how these products are produced, raised, whatever, coming into the state. So we have to pay attention to this because this could become an area, and this is why justice was involved. They didn't want a bunch of competing rules coming into place with conservative states and liberal states setting varying rules that make it harder and harder for states to trade amongst themselves. Now on to the fun part that Jenny wanted me to talk about. So in 3 years ago, basically, a Montgomery County Circuit Court held that the state had to take into account within the water quality permit for CAFOs, they had to take into account the air emissions coming into that. Specifically, ammonia emissions was the main issue at this. Looking at this, the circuit court looked at it and said basically the word admit in the statute is only stuff that can come from the air. How many people have ever had to draft a statute or read a statute in their lives? We use every humanly word possible that could mean every synonym for one word to use it, because somebody may get fancy and say, well, I wasn't doing that, I was doing this, and you didn't say that counted under the law. So admit was in with discharge and every other synonym for discharge within there. So it made sense why it was in there. The court agreed that these ammonia exhausts that could come out of the exhaust fans were a point source that could then go into a body of water. So let's think about that for a second. We're looking at air exhaust coming out of an ammonia, out of a fan. It's a point source, and it could potentially go into these covered waters. The view of EPA is this is a non-point source pollution. Because why? It's coming out of a pipe, but it goes up in the air, and then it comes back down. Is there a pipe once it comes back down? No. So it's non-point source pollution. That has always been their view and continues to be their view. There were also past court decisions that the circuit court just said don't apply in this case, that clearly said you don't regulate this in this case. So the Maryland Supreme Court reversed this decision. MDE, in some of the complaints, they go through a long history of the permit challenges over the years with this CAFO permit. The biggest thing they first started out with, how many poultry farms are in Montgomery County, Maryland? 0. The court first calls him out for blatantly forum shopping and taking it into a forum where there were no parties that would have been aware of this until the last possible minute. They pointed out it should have been brought somewhere on the Eastern Shore and not in Montgomery County, Maryland. That's the first thing that happened. The other thing they did was they upheld the permit based on arguments made by MDE. MDE already had taken account some of this within how they were setting up the permit, so that was taken care of. And then they already had water quality standards set up that took this into account. So according to the court, they had already done this. They didn't actually have to take into account the ammonia emissions. MDE, in some briefing, admitted they were already taking this into account within all of this, and the permit already complied with everything the state required for these permits and federal law required. So they left it alone. Yeah, so this has been the biggest thing. I had to remember why I put this slide in here. The bigger issue has always been the area where this is going to come into play is not within probably the Clean Air Act, but it's going to be within, how many people know what the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act is within the U.S.? So there are no trash people within this room. This is the law that regulates how all trash is distributed within the U.S. and how it's taken care of. The idea is within it, nutrients are specifically exempted in it when they're used as a part of growing plants. And courts have looked at this and said if you put beyond what a plant needs, beyond what plant health needs, that could potentially start becoming dumping under that. So that's where a lot of these issues are going to continue to play out. And we've seen that play out in states that are not Maryland. And I got about a few minutes left.
You're good.
I'm good?
You're good. Take your time.
I'll take my time. I don't want you to get off track today, Jenny.
That's all right.
So this is Maryland's right to farm law. How many people have seen this law before? Everybody's kind of looked at it, told me they've seen it before. So within the law, you need to be an agriculture, silviculture, or commercial seafood and fishing operation, been in operation for at least 1 year. Pay attention to that 1 year thing. It's going to come back into play here in about a second. And you need to be in compliance with all applicable federal, state, local, environmental, health, all the normal laws we would expect a farm to be in requirement with. Skip over the next part. Within this law, you do not go to court. You go before either a county ag reconciliation board or you go before mediation before the State Department of Ag's ag mediation program. And in a lot of cases, the county board will require you just to go through ag mediation because it's easier to send you through ag mediation and have them work it out with you than potentially them try to settle the dispute. That's not what happened in a case I'm about to talk about that some of you may have heard about. The idea is we want to limit future disputes within all of this. The other issue that comes up within all this is counties are allowed to set their own ordinances and regulations in place as associated with this. Luckily, all but one have followed the same path. Hopefully none of you are in Baltimore County because that's the one that has not followed that path. The idea is they institute these ag reconciliation boards within those ordinances, and then they just set into place that they want every operation within the county to be following generally accepted ag practices. Generally accepted ag practices are anything the university or a soil conservation district says are okay to use. Or if you can't show that they show it's okay to use, it's anything, it's on the party complaining to prove that it's not generally accepted. Then we had a couple issues that developed last summer. The first is an administrative issue we'll discuss later briefly just because it's an easy one to solve. The other issue is if I tell you there's a one-year provision that you need to be in operation, what would you think that means? That your farm needs to be in operation for 1 year or you need to own that piece of property for more than 1 year? Farm needs to be in operation. That's the way most courts have interpreted that, but not in Talbot County. In March of 2020, we have an operator buying farmland. 2021, they start storing and applying biosolids within the property. If I remember right, it was a mix of poultry stuff and seafood stuff. I have a video up in this next to show the bug problem, if I remember correctly. 2021, late 2021, neighbors began to complain. If this works, oh, no, it's the next. That did not work, but that was all the bugs that magically appeared on that property after applications, and you could watch them fly up. Within that, the county board started hearing the case first. They found that the right to farm law applied. Guess what happens when we have a county board review one of these decisions? You have an agency decision that then can be heard before a court. So instead of not having to go to court the way the law was set up, now you have to go to court. The circuit court in Talbot County reviewing this decision found no, the law did not apply because they had not owned the land for a year. It was tied to the land. So every time land changes hands, at least from this interpretation, the statute of repose that is within the law resets itself and we start the timeline over again. So it doesn't matter how long the properties have been farmed. It matters how long that person has farmed that piece of property. So this could fluctuate depending on how long people have owned pieces of property over time. That decision is currently under appeal. This Court of Appeals, I don't think, has heard arguments yet on it. If I can't remember correctly, I've got to ask one of the attorneys involved. And remember how I told you there were two tracks within all of this? Go before the county board or ag mediation. I think it's on the next slide, yep. If you had just gone through mediation with that, guess what there isn't is? There's no agency decision because there's no record developed because it's a mediation and you can't review something coming out of mediation like that. So there was a simpler path potentially forward to do this where there would have been no review. So that could happen potentially if we look at this moving forward. And then my final one to talk about with right to farm is this. Maryland's law requires this. Most states within right to farm require you to be in compliance with federal, state, local rules. Why? We only want to protect good actors. These laws set in place what we expect people to be doing within operations to stay away from being nuisances. I've already talked about that, so we can move on. What happens if we're trespassing when we do all this? What happens if we're creating a trespass? And you might be asking yourself, how could you create a trespass? Well, I'm going to walk you through how you could be doing that. Could that bring you into play to having committed a nuisance that doesn't allow the right to farm law to come into play? So let's talk about a Kansas farmer who did not like anybody. So this hog farmer in Kansas decides he's going to build a new barn, set up a new operation. He already has a few. To do all this, he has to truck out the nutrients that are going to be done or pipe them out. He's got to set up a 3-pipeline situation, which requires him to set up 2 to carry water and 1 to carry the effluent from the operation, just to run through a pivot so he can apply it to farmland. He picks a farm near other people's houses who specifically told him he could go a mile up the road and he would not impact anybody's life. That comes into play here in just a second. To run this pipeline, he ran it along the county road right away to do this. He never got the permission of the county to do it, And he never got the neighboring landowners to do it. Because if you have a county road right-of-way across your property, what does the county have? They just have the right to have people drive across the road, right? You still own that property. It's just the right-of-way for public transportation. Technically, in a lot of states, you can actually lay these pipelines on the right-of-way as long as they're for the common good to carry product across. This pipeline's not really that situation. He goes and sets this pipeline up, gets no neighbor permission, gets no county permission to do it. When the neighbors report him to the sheriff, he looks at the sheriff and goes, no, I can do this, don't worry. I got permission. Decides to go home for the day and then comes back tomorrow and finishes the pipeline. When he gets the pipeline put into play, he's already annoyed with his neighbors for calling him the sheriff on him and raising all these other problems, so he sets the pivot so it hits their house. In fact, it hit the wife every time she went out. They had so many problems, they had to move to Nebraska, to their vacation home in Nebraska, which I always ask the question, how bad was Kansas where they were living that they wanted to move to Nebraska to live? The sale of the property fell through because the farmer that was going to buy the house didn't want to live there because of the smell. So all of this happens. He's in compliance with every other law, but is he in compliance with every other law? No, he's not. The right to farm law, the court points out, doesn't apply because the first thing he did to do all this was he committed trespass to get it across. And the trespass continued every day the pipeline sat there. So he did not get the protection of the right to farm law. As you're reading the opinion, like, if this guy gets the protection, this is the worst actor in the world to ever get it. And he doesn't get it. The other question I have for you, and this is just a good etiquette if you're ever sued not to do this. If you're sued, what would you do if you're the hog farmer? Would you double down on the number of days you spray, or at least try to cut back to look like you're trying to be a good neighbor? He doubled down. He does more stupid stuff. Don't worry, it gets worse. He doubled down. They go to court. They are able to get punitive damages on this. The punitive damages were 3 times the actual damages, which the damages were you have to remove this pipeline and restore the land to its actual deal. It was like $500,000 in punitive damages in the end. When he appealed it, he goes to the State Court of Appeals. The State Court of Appeals looks at the record and then the additional information that's presented to them. He not only did that, after he lost in court, he stacked nutrients outside the house for days just so they could smell it. This guy sucked at losing. He lost and doubled down every time and made himself look worse. The court was like, yeah, we can freely uphold all this because you're just bad and you've done everything wrong in this situation. And we'll wrap up. So CAFOs are going to continue to be a concern. Prop 12. I did cut one thing out, and I'll talk about it at the end. I forgot I cut that slide out. Maryland right to farm decision. Currently, if you're in one county, it may reset every time. That opinion has no precedent value across the state, but it depends on what the Court of Appeals does as to what that may end up doing. I use a Kansas right to farm decision from late last year just to highlight, don't be like that guy if you get sued. Kind of try to be nice to some people. And then the last thing I didn't point out is I know it's going to come up in other presentations, and I will point this out too. The biggest thing we saw last year and some patent litigation coming up is Bayer, which now owns Monsanto, is enforcing the patent on the new XtendiMax technology. So if you're saving that seed, they're coming after you again, and you get to go to lovely St. Louis to defend yourself. The other thing they're doing is if they can go through records, so this is Bayer going through records to show you sprayed over-the-top dicamba of unapproved dicambas, you win the lottery, and you not only get sued if you're saving the seed, but you're getting sued for violating the patent for misapplying the wrong new pesticides over your crop. Why is Bayer doing that? They don't want to get hit with a drift litigation again, so they're trying to force it to show people that they're actively enforcing the patent and they're forcing you to follow the rules. So that's out there. I'm sure that will come up with MDA later. I'm a part of this site. We do Ag Law Fridays at Southern Ag Today. They do marketing news. policy, crop insurance, other things there. You can adopt that there. I do a blog at agris.umd.edu. And then I got questions, I'm sure.
You have time for some questions.
I left them about 5 minutes for questions. But nobody probably wants to ask. Oh, I see a hand.
In Centerville, they're growing pot in a building or something anyway. Their fumes, which don't smell too great, are coming out. Wind directions around here most of the time are northwest. Sympathy Village is northwest of that, and they're raising hell. What is the story there?
That one I don't know, because I hadn't heard that one until right now. But my guess is, depending on how they're controlling the air, if they can do something to better control it, it's going to be a right to farm issue to start with. And as long as they've been in operation for a year, they may get protections of the law. Yeah. But if they haven't been, then they can potentially have the law enforced to kind of get them to do something to put trees up or something. It's a right to farm issue.
So that illegal crop is the right to farm.
Oh, wait, is it illegal or, well, is it legal or,
It's legal pot.
if it's legal, it's going to be a right to farm.
It's technically still a Schedule I drug.
But under the state, it's now,
Yeah, but it's still a Schedule I drug under the federal government.
but under the state, it doesn't matter with that, it
They're
just,
just going like this.
yeah.
They can't,
We're in this gray area with pot.
yeah, you can't use the cash, you gotta use cash.
Yeah. That's the best answer I can give on that one, because I don't know. And I think I saw one more hand.
May not apply to your Kansas farmer, but someone who's out of compliance, the difference between getting bad legal advice versus getting good legal advice and not following it.
Yeah.
Still in trouble.
You're still, so the question is getting good legal advice versus bad legal advice in that case? Yeah, whether you're following or not. In that case, too, that guy was probably getting good legal advice. He has freely, I've talked to somebody at the Kansas Department of Ag that knows when he comes in, has freely been like the most happiest individual they have to deal with. He freely does not believe any law should apply to him. The discussion we had when we presented this before a group of ag lawyers was we called him basically the real world Ron Swanson, where he did not believe any law applied to him. But he was like slightly not as happy as Ron was most days on Parks and Rec. He was just a miserable person, it sounded like, to be around. So he was probably getting legal advice. He just didn't want to listen to it. So it helps if you listen to what attorneys tell you to do. We're not actually trying to screw you over. We're trying to help you out.
On that note, we'll end.
Sounds like a good note to end on.
You're welcome.
So just a couple items here. Well, there's a lot in AFO world, but in recent months, we've been looking at the common ownership, land under the control of the operator, as far as operators that may have combined their plans as no lands versus land operations. But if you're actually an operator who manages your fields as a separate business entity, you're still considered an owner. So we're working with the process right now to have those plans actually combine as a land operation. Second item is organic poultry pasture. We work with our technical partners here the last number of months. We have finally a guidance that's complete. We do have it posted on our webpage. We're working with MDA to have that included in toolkit as far as a section item to manage those operators that are managing birds on pasture for a limited time of the year. So we'll work through that process here and get those folks, those plans in place to have them registered. And one last item as far as an update on numbers. Currently, under the current 19 AF permit cycle, we have 368 AFOs registered in the state. We have 125 left yet to be registered, and then the balance is either on public notice or have gone through the public notice period. So inspections, Last year, 242 inspections. We did bring on a new inspector on board with us to help improve those numbers. So we're trending in that direction. So if you have any information or any questions, I do have information at the display table, record-keeping documents, things of that nature. Come see me. I'll be able to help answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Yep.
Thanks for that update. All right, we will now take a 15-minute break, but before we do, just know when we come back, if you need the aquatic weed control recertification, it'll be over here in the meeting room, and we'll start